How's everyone?
Excellent, excited to start. So maybe we can give a small intro. I can give a small intro because I know all of you guys, but what I really want is for you guys to meet each other. So as I mentioned to you, we've had these calls with our players who appreciate good critiques. And since the Gruyter invited me to Ant's presentation, I thought this is the time. Now we should actually get this to more people because I want expert players, expert researchers to share their ideas. Because just as you are here, I'm pretty sure that more people will benefit from a recording of this kind of casual calls around games with expert ideas. So I'll give a brief intro. As you all know, we love games, and we're living a crazy time at the moment because while games as an industry are bigger than movies and music combined, there was something that was mentioned at Anne's book presentation that left me with the mouth open, and that is that sadly games don't have that much of an impact on the sphere beyond games. You can have politicians, policymakers, important people who will gladly say they have never played a game. In contrast, it would be crazy to say I have never watched a movie, or I have never listened to a song, or even crazier, I have never read a book. That's suicide at any industry. But what's happening with games? What's missing? There are naturally the issues with the exploitation of developers, gender issues, gender disparity, but something that I believe we all can agree on and that maybe we can have some impact is a lack of good critique. Jonas has mentioned this to me a lot, that we have this reductive number on Metacritic, on so many places, since consumers just want an easy way to purchase the next big game. We're constantly being reduced to these are the three main points. You get better graphics, you get better killing, better shooting, and buy the next game, and that's it. However,
that's
games
very difficult. That's a big mountain to try and climb.
Yeah, and that will continue. I mean, that's the juggernaut of an industry. But fortunately, there's also the opportunity to play more games, for you guys to, I believe, look for other kinds of titles, and something necessary so that this link actually happens between the producers of the games and the consumers is for the discourse to allow us to explore them, to ask questions about them. And you guys make the best questions. By the way, I will introduce myself for those of you who don't know us, and later on, you guys, I'd love for you to introduce yourselves too. I am Javier. I'm the director of Dream of Darkness, a Lovecraft+Aztecs game about real history and mysteries for PC. And now I will give the mic to the very first person who joined, and that is Avatar of Chaos. What can you tell us about yourself, man? What is your expertise, so our new friends know?
I am Ava. I am a cosmic horror game reviewer. I do mostly traditional and the less inspective ones.
Nice, perfect. And you have a great newsletter, and you have become one of the authorities at Reddit at Lovecraft, right?
Yes, I recently became a source of the community.
Congrats.
Thank you.
We're very proud to have him. Next, who was on board? It was Anne. So I'd love to hear, what can you tell us about your work, Anne?
Hi, I'm Anne Lydia McDivitt. I am actually a video game historian. I have a PhD in history and specialize in video game history, specifically in the 70s and 80s. But I'm actually branching out now for my new project. Yay. And so I've actually published a book last year, and that is called Hot Tubs and Pac-Man. And that is mostly about gender in the video game industry in the 70s and 80s. And hilariously, my mom got me like a tiny Pac-Man machine for Christmas. And so like now when I get bored at work, I'm just like, all right, time to play some Pac-Man really quick. But in addition to the fact that I am a video game historian, I'm also a pretty avid gamer. I play basically in my free time. That's all I do. And I run a podcast with my best friend that we look at video games, anime, and manga. And that is called SAC OVA.
Oh, if you went to Japan, you'll have a lot of fun.
So I'm really immersed in this culture, and I like when people are looking at games critically and thinking about how we can think about them more in an academic way, but also just a more critical way.
Perfect. That is so exciting, Anne. Thank you. Next comes...
Also, here's Maxwell.
Who has the face of the state of the industry. We were just saying, oh, look at that. So now comes Shelly. What can you tell us about your expertise, Shelly? I love it when you say it.
Oh, I've been a practicing witch and occultist since I was 26 after a recent breakup, strangely enough. But I have what people would call an ofrenda, and this is it. Recently, I've actually did a 5-day ritual to try and do a dream journey to Relay.
Nice.
And it actually went. It did not go as planned. What actually happened is that Beelzebub kept appearing in my dreams instead.
Oh my
Lord
god.
of Flies. He was, the second angel to follow Lucifer after he left heaven.
Oh, that is so exciting. So who
Personally,
comes?
From the feeling I get from Beelzebub, he is literally kind of like Beetlejuice.
Like Beetlejuice, so we can invoke him. We'll try that someday later.
No, not that way. If you did try to do that, he's like, he'll show you a real showtime, and then pulls out the middle finger.
He has an attitude. I can imagine.
He can be a little bit of an asshole, but at the same time, if you were to align yourself with him or work with him, he is a very, very protective spirit.
Oh my god, that sounds like a good influence then.
And he is an oppressor, but not in a bad way. But you gotta crush coal to make diamonds. He kind of does that to try and pull out the best in you.
Oh my god, so he has played Pathologic. Thanks a lot, Shelly.
You can say that. So he is a spirit that you gotta respect. He is very, very powerful, and he is very well invoked for like death magic and death-based magic and stuff. He is also a good provider, and sometimes you got to go through tension and stress to go forward.
Of course.
So far, that hasn't quite happened with me yet, but it's what I'm expecting.
Interesting. We'll love hearing about that during our next conversations, I'm pretty sure. Next comes one of our expert players, actually our taste expert, with whom we validate so many things about our game, our very own Bobcats.
Hey guys. I'm Bobcat. My qualifications are I play games. That's kind of it. I worked for many years as a writing tutor. I was a screenwriter for a while, and so writing is kind of like my background. But gaming has always sort of been something that I've been really interested in. Otherwise, I'm a streamer. I have been working on growing a YouTube channel, so that's kind of everything I've been doing in my spare time in addition to this, which is why I haven't played much Pathologic. But yeah, so that's me.
Perfect. Thanks a lot, Bobcat. Next comes our Redditor in the house, our very own Jonas. What can you tell us about yourself, man?
Yeah, I'm Jonas. I'm from Norway. I'm studying biology, so I'm taking a bachelor in that right now. And I'm just here because I love to complain about the games and the mainstream. And I really like games, and this group for me is a nice way of just getting to play those motivating myself to play those more obscure games like Pathologic and such, and just having conversations, because on the internet it's tough finding like good conversation on games or anything really. So that's why I'm here.
Perfect, Jonas. Thanks a lot. And we have Iro. She also studies something very interesting like Anne, but you can tell us, please, Iro.
Hi everyone, I'm Iro. I'm Greek, and I am the least qualified, I think, from everyone here to talk about games in the way that you talk about games. My PhD is in English literature and medical humanities, so I study and write about narrative, history, illness, and medicine. And I look at games, I guess, the way I would look at a book, as a cultural
I'm gonna cut you off.
text.
I gotta go. But
No
what
worries,
I will
Shelley.
do to treat everyone is to provide links about more information on Beelzebub. So it'll be there for y'all to learn and know.
Thanks, Shelly. No worries. Take care. Bye. Sorry,
Bye,
Iro.
You too.
Please continue.
Bye.
Bye.
Right, so yeah, I'm interested in hearing what you guys have to say about Pathologic, because I had such a difficult time with it. I've many thoughts on that, but yeah, basically I look at games as I would examine a book. So that's my interest in this.
Yeah, the intersection of humanities and games is something that fortunately can also give us a framework in order to analyze them. From the production side, for example, there are many conventions that we have taken from filmmaking. For example, our camera angles, how we create our storyboards. However, on the analytical side, on the critique side, I believe we benefit a lot from literature, and especially with how limited sometimes mainstream journalism can be. I believe we would benefit overall to have more tools from the narrative side. So I'm excited. And I will also mention which game we're commenting today, and that is Pathologic 1. So our players voted for that, and they themselves later on told me, oh my god, we made a mistake. Why would that be, Jonas?
Yeah.
Why do you think it was a mistake?
Well, so there are some games that I want to play, but some games are just really inaccessible. Even if I'm a pretentious type, they're just really hard to get through. And Pathologic is one of those games. But I played 1 hour, and then I just stopped, and then I restarted because I just found out that I am going through this game way too fast, and this is probably because I've been like conditioned by other games to sort of just like progress as fast as you can, especially if you sort of know that you have a time limit. So I just this time I just went slowly through every conversation, because it's so dense. Like it feels like every sentence is saying something like vaguely, and then I have to sort of stop and think about it. The next, think about it.
Yeah, you raise great points. And by the way, this is all chaos. So feel free to jump in whenever you want to comment or make a question. Please feel free to do so. I believe that most of us experienced difficulty here. It was something very interesting for all of us. Do you have, Anne, any comments on that?
Man, this game. So I didn't really know what I was getting myself into when I agreed to play this. It is a challenging game, and it's also an anxiety-inducing game. Like the entire time, I was just like, "Oh my god, I feel like I need to take like some kind of anxiety medication to get through this because there's just so much going on." And like it kind of reminds me with the time limit of like Majora's Mask, how you have that sense of doom that something's going to happen. You don't have like a menacing moon in the sky this time, but you know this is an atmospheric, pretty dark kind of game anyway. Like everything is very brown.
Yeah.
And so just the entire time I was playing, and I actually died pretty early on because, food is kind of hard to find. Imagine that. And I think that especially playing this in the context of what we're going through now, globally is pretty intense because, you do have a thing of like, oh God, everything is going wrong. Well, now food is skyrocketing or you can't find it. Medicine's hard to find. Like that is something that everybody has dealt with since early 2020. So it added an extra layer onto this game that was just anxiety layers and layers of anxiety and difficulty.
Oh yeah, the weird thing about it is I had to kind of change the way I think about how I approach a game. Like for example, I started out as the bachelor and I woke up in the woman's house and she mentions that there's somebody outside, and so I go and talk to him, and you have the tutorial people, but then you also have the guy over by the fire. And my first thought was, oh, okay, my first quest is I have to run him off or, get him off the property. And so I spoke to him and I said, hey, get out of here. And he attacked me, and I realized the game hadn't told me how to pull out fists or engage in combat at all or anything. And there were vague hints that like, no, you're not supposed to go around and, kill people or anything. And so like my first thought upon booting it up was this feels a little bit like almost like a Bethesda game in the sense of like wandering around talking to people and things like that. And it's very much not. A lot of games offer a kind of like pacifist option, but one thing that I really kind of admire about this game is that it encourages that. It's not so much built around the idea of combat and dungeon crawling and puzzle solving as it is kind of solving everyday problems, it more in the context of these sort of extraordinary circumstances.
I agree completely. Iro, do you have any ideas?
Yes. So I think that what really threw me, I agree with everything that you've said so far. What really threw me was how the narrative actually seemed to be contesting the survival mode. So if you paid attention, but really paid attention, because reputation is such an important stat and you had to really choose your words wisely, then you ran out of time. And I thought it was a little bit misleading because in the beginning I thought, okay, I'm going to be building the narrative, which I guess you kind of do. But actually it's really purely a survival game. And I think, I guess those aren't for everybody. I think you have to have a certain type of practice. My first instinct was to just roam around the map and just be, a flaneuse and just look at the buildings and go in the really weird structure on the side of the map.
I think it's called
the polydrome.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah. So it doesn't encourage that though. And by the time I realized I hadn't really saved properly, so I guess I think that was what threw me mostly. The fact that the narrative, you had to find the perfect balance between, the narrative and, finding lemons and coffee beans to make sure your health is okay. I've never in my life during a game shouted, "Where are those lemons?"
Yeah, I think. Go ahead, Jonas, please.
No, I was just like you mentioned narrative because Anne also mentioned that she saw stagehands, and I thought that maybe like because you start in a theater or stage, and I thought like that was more of the developer telling you how to sort of interpret the story, right? Because they are the actors, and even in regular games, it's usually not stated like who you are as a player. And in this game, so here's the actors, and now you're suddenly inside the actor, and then you talk to the executor and the tragedian outside of the start, and he says basically, you can say that, oh, I am the director to the executor, and you can say to the tragedian, I am not the actor or something. So you can sort of, the game is very aware about like.
Yeah, that's metafiction right there, which is actually quite brilliant. Yeah.
Yeah, a framing device in such in your face way is something that I have not seen yet on a game. I have seen in other places. On a related note, something that both Ito and Ant mentioned is that the survival aspect for me gave me a new kind of catharsis. I have faced many challenges in games. I mean, that's part of the appeal, to constantly solve problems, achieving fun. However, having a real world pandemic out there and having a pandemic here, and at the same time facing the mundane but necessary tasks that you need to sleep, you need to eat, you need to be careful about what this small town will say about you. Oh, that was way too much. And that was when I realized that most games usually, let's say, distill reality and only leave you what is fun. They only leave you the area, let's say, about kill the dragon, be a hero, but not so much about what will the hero do when he has to retire, or the boring questions, the boring mundanity. And this game is the opposite. It does have an intriguing, exceptional moment. There's been a murder and you're coming to town. That is exceptional, as most narratives require. But the layer of the mundane is something that adds a lot of difficulty, because that is really difficult in life. And I appreciate that they included it.
Yeah, it's kind of like, what it reminds me of a little bit is something like how Papers, Please can manage to be a really compelling narrative, even though you're not doing much of anything important. You're sitting there at a border crossing checking passports, but it manages to take those kind of mundane circumstances, and because of the way it's framed, it makes those things feel very important. You know, something that would be a side quest in another game becomes your life. And I think that's something that Pathologic does really well. Like, comparing it to, for example, Fallout New Vegas. You have a hardcore mode where you have to eat and sleep, but you don't really. You know, you sleep every couple of days for a few hours, or, you know, you have to occasionally eat some junk food. Whereas with this, it's very much... I like whenever a game kind of scales back and takes those challenges and instead... frames them in a more realistic and grounded way, you know.
Was it clear to you though when things had to be done? I'm not sure if this is because I'm not a very big fan of the survival game. I like narrative games, but you know, I don't like to be stressed or pretend I'm having fun when it's not actual fun. But it just wasn't clear to me how I should manage health, exhaustion, immunity, and so on. And I kept dying in my sleep very often. So I'm pretty sure I would not survive. I'm actually surprised I have survived this pandemic. But yeah, it just wasn't going well for me. And I don't know if there's something that I missed.
No, you're very on point, Ito. Many games we have to take care of giving enough feedback to the players so that they know which are the resources, how they affect you, and I believe it's on purpose that this game has not given us enough feedback, because part of the appeal is for us to die and to realize, that is my interpretation naturally, but realize how frail we are, and that this difficulty and mundanity of this part of the universe in this game.
It should be noted that
great point.
I just want to add that the guys who made the game are Russians, and the game is from 2006 or something, so they probably have Russians have often a very old-fashioned view of what's good game design, right? They still use their manuals and the games from like the 90s and such. So yeah, go on.
I was going to say, have you heard you've seen this new game, Escape from Tarkov? It has very, very similar comments that you know nothing about. There's no context. So, which is another interesting question for me, at least. What's the text without context? How useful can then the text be? But we don't have to answer this now.
I mean, I will say I've read some Russian literature. I've played some Russian games. This isn't all that unusual for games kind of from that sort of culture, like it's a different sort of expectation. Like, for example, I played Metro 2033. I played the Redux version and the original, and I actually really prefer the original. And one of the things that I like is they took away a lot of the indicators that you would normally have in a game, and instead made them more immersive. For example, whenever you go up on the surface, you have to wear a gas mask. And the way that you track your gas mask filters is you have a dive watch that has a dive bezel. And you set your dive bezel for where your filter is going to expire. But you have to keep checking your watch. You have to keep pressing the dedicated check watch button in order to keep track of what's going on. And I've noticed that little systems like that are kind of, they're very Russian, for lack of a better term. It's the idea of, we're not going to tell you the answers. We're going to give you the systems necessary to check them, but you have to be very much on top of things. And again, I've read a lot of Russian literature and played a lot of Russian games. Very few of them are what I would describe as fun in the traditional sense. You don't usually take Tolstoy for a nice beach read or anything like that. It's a very sort of particular style to it that is, to me, downright miserable is kind of how I would put it. But interesting and compelling in its own way, in a very different way than I think. You don't get that same sort of like fantasy and escapism that you do in more Western, European and American media.
Those are great points, Bobcat. About that in a related manner, I didn't know, and it's so good that you have played these Russian games, that this was somewhat common in apparently their culture. I did feel that the writing could be Russian inspired. For example, I felt a bit of Dostoevsky because the lines were so long and with morality constantly involved. It was for me like reading Crime and Punishment. And
written by a first-year undergraduate in English literature. I might add. I'm sorry. I don't mean to trash the dialogue. Maybe it's a translation matter. I just thought something was off. Yeah. And the fact that most of the women were dressed in a way that promoted the plot in what way? I don't know. What do I know? I survived only 2 days, but
No, those are great points, because I was going to mention that I detected at the beginning that this could be more or less the inspiration or the intention, but as you will say, there were errors for me, at least on the style. Sometimes it would actually take me away from the game because I would think this line is not working. However, I think it's intentional because all of the aesthetic, not only the texts, are more or less like this. For example, the 3D models. You would have these gorgeous pictures sometimes, well lit, good angles, and the 3D model would be atrocious. However, I believe that they're constantly wanting us to feel displaced, uncomfortable. Even the music, the very first music for me on the menu was gorgeous for me. However, on other parts of the game, the soundtrack was so cold, so different for me. So I think that it's part of their intention, and I am also I have a bit of a suspicion that it's also resources limited, as it happens with most games. And then you say, no, it's a feature. It's our intention as artists.
It's important to remember that this is at best a AA game made by a Russian developer. There are legitimately some issues with the language barrier there, and I think it's not even so much that as it is a combination of language barrier and their intention. As you were talking about, earlier, if the intention is to portray this as being similar to a stage play with very sort of classical and wordy lines, and then you also don't speak the language perfectly, that's going to kind of throw things a little out of whack in terms of how to convey the narrative. I feel a little bit bad, but at a certain point with most of the lines, I took to just reading the first sentence because that was usually summing up what the rest of the line was. They were taking about 2 or 3 in order to say what they meant at the very beginning. And so that kind of helped me along. But yeah, like just by the very nature of what this game is, I think there are going to be issues with how that narrative is conveyed.
And speaking of lines, the actual spoken dialogue when you speak to somebody, like oftentimes those lines are extremely bizarre and have nothing to do with what they're saying in the text box. And so, like they would say something, and I'm like, what? Excuse me? What? And so, like, there were multiple times that I was just, like, completely thrown off by this person because they're just talking about mundane stuff, and then they are, like, talking about something just bananas in their spoken dialogue. And it also changes depending on, like, what's going on. But that was very strange for me.
It was, definitely. I believe that, again, we have this disparity, intentional disparity, and that, however, kept me more alert, because as Bobcat has said, on any game or genre, eventually you have your conventions. So especially with movies, that happens to me. I can more or less predict what's going to happen the closer we are to the formula. But this game, I eventually became morbidly curious about what weird lines would come out with the audio. Because sometimes they would say, there's murder on the text. There's been this murder and my family, but the audio would say, oh, my hair looks gorgeous today.
It's so weird.
Yeah.
It's so weird.
It reminds me
I think
a
there
lot.
was no editing in this game. If I could sum everything, like all the problems, I would say there wasn't any editing. Like it's like reading a very atmospheric essay by one of my students, and you're like, yes, some great ideas, but all of the ideas are there, all of them. So, for example, they tried to combine the mundane and the epic. There are some truly epic and actually really insightful lines, like the prologue at the beginning. Every time you died, which I did a lot, so I learned about the prologue. As I'd like to remind you, that paragraph, it says, why does the illness or the pandemic, remember, touch the precious aspect of our lives? This is brilliant. This is really, really insightful. But I think it was undermined by all this fanfare in the dialogue.
You have to kind of dig through the long lines in order to find these gems. Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
I wonder how this relates to the games industry on a bigger scale, because this is very different from AAA games. However, it did well commercially. It even has a sequel. It has even been re-released. So maybe we will benefit a lot from players. How can you explain that this game is very different from Zelda? And at the same time, I believe for these developers, it was a success commercially.
I grew up with Hideo Kojima games, and so I've constantly had to sort of explain that to myself, because Hideo Kojima has a similar thing in that he desperately needs an editor, but anytime an editor comes in, it ruins the feel of the game. Really? Metal Gear Solid 5 is a fantastic example where you can see Hideo Kojima is there, you can see his presence, but he was so clearly held back in what he was able to create by the circumstances around it. And so the game comes across as feeling weird or unfinished in comparison to something like Metal Gear Solid 2, which people would describe as weird. It is weird, but it's weird in a way that feels very familiar to me because I grew up with his games. And when you look at Death Stranding, part of the deal with Death Stranding and why it got kind of mixed reception is because it wasn't Metal Gear, and that was what people knew Hideo Kojima for. But what Death Stranding is Hideo Kojima being able to make whatever game he wants. The thing is, he had nobody to say no, and he had nobody to maybe cut lines here and there, and so that's why it comes across as so weird and contentious, is because he didn't have that editing staff, and he didn't really have to answer to anybody. And we see that with a lot of different projects. I've been streaming The Outer Worlds. The Outer Worlds is Obsidian working with their own IP with no other companies. And you start to see both really good things that they do really well, and their sort of excesses and their issues that come up because they don't have a publisher that's really, hammering things home for them. And so, you see this in the indie space, and you see it a lot with Pathologic, in that this is clearly a game that didn't have a whole lot of oversight. It had a small development team that was working on this passion project that they wanted to create. And so you're going to get a very warts and all type of game. But in many ways, those are the more interesting games, because that's a game that was made with passion that the developers wanted to make, as opposed to a game that was made by committee,
Oh yeah, and I think that final remark summed it up, Lovecraft. Well, I believe all of us can agree that editing is so helpful. The opposite direction that sometimes our industry goes to about a committee, well, that is the worst possible thing, at least for me as a director. That's why I saw the Steam reviews after you guys voted for the title, and I saw that actually people appreciate how convoluted the texts are. Continuing what you mentioned, Bobcat, it's like gamers fortunately are now appreciating some sort of, like in the movies, when there is a director's voice, when you can perceive a director, his intentionality, even with his flaws. Like what happens with Tarantino or George Lucas, that he clearly has some excesses. However, you do get a unique experience with those directors, and I believe with these kinds of unedited games. Naturally,
yeah. And
go ahead, Bobcat.
I was going to say, with film and video games, what you oftentimes find is these good, artistes often find somebody who they're good at working with. They'll have a writer who they work with really well, or they'll have like a director will have a good director of photography or something like that. And so it's not the studio reining them in so much as it is somebody who they trust and who has a vision. Like when Lucas was working with Spielberg on the Indiana Jones movies, not a whole lot of Lucas came through, but he was indispensable to that process. You got both Lucas and Spielberg. And like with games, sometimes you have people who you work with who just kind of get it. And so even though you have maybe a strange director or a strange vision, because everybody is working toward the same goal, you can create something that is a little bit more coherent and a little bit more cohesive whenever you're making a game. And so I think that editing process is necessary, but I think that part of it is it has to jive with the person's original vision,
And at the same time, make a profit.
Yeah.
Be somehow commercially viable. Go ahead, Jonas.
Yeah, no, I just want to add to, like, you asked about why it seems like why that game seems successful today. I think it's important to remember that, like, historically, maybe roast me here, but historically speaking, like, games, especially story-driven games, are very emotionally, they aren't really rich, right? They're like we played One Shot, and
yeah,
to me that's kind of novel, because there's warmth and there's sadness, and like when I was young, like, there's usually just one feeling that this like 30-hour game wants me to feel, right? And it's just very one-sided, sort of. It's like for example, the term corridor shooter is not just that you're shooting down a corridor. It's like it's just that one feeling or one atmosphere that the game is going for. So this game came out in 2001,
2005.
Five. Yeah. So I think that I think people that even like just going back 20 years, people's expectations are a bit lower. They can sort of tolerate just that. Let's say a one-sided game, or because there's just, I feel like there's just one feeling, like Anne said, like it's just anxiety, hostility, like this. I'm not getting any warmth from any characters, and they all do, like, it's not a roller coaster, so to speak.
Have
I
you
also
ever
just want to
felt?
mention Snatcher is Kojima's best game.
Yes.
Period.
You're not wrong. Yeah.
I have to play that game as well.
Yeah.
Oh,
Well,
man.
I streamed it. The VODs are up. You can check it out sometime.
I'll check
It's
it out.
but yeah, no, it's interesting. It borrows a lot from a lot of different pieces, but it has a very Kojima feel to it.
It does, and the OST rules. It's so good.
Oh yeah.
Yeah.
That's actually something I really like about Pathologic, though, is I actually like the music in it a lot. Not all of it's fitting. Like you'll be sitting there and it'll be this beautiful ambient track, and then it'll randomly go into techno or like EDM or something like that. I don't know what's going on.
Russian techno, by the way.
Yeah, it's another trope I've noticed in Russian games. Funnily enough, is randomly soundtracks not quite fitting what's going on, or maybe fitting in a way that I don't understand. I would love to read more about how soundtracks are reflective of the culture of a game in which, or of where a game is made. But yeah, but what I will say is I love all of Pathologic's music, even if I don't always think that it fits the situation.
I agree, yeah. Ava, you also wanted to mention something, sorry?
I was about to ask, you ever felt a sense of nihilization from any of the games so far?
A feeling of what, sorry?
Nihilization? Nihilism?
Yeah, maybe, I'd love to hear your guys' opinion on it, on nihilism. Yeah, did you perceive that in this game?
No, I don't. Well, no, not really, because I feel like right now the actor is sort of like maybe. I think it's a bit. I don't think I feel nihilism, because when I met, for example, the Kane family or like any other person, they have sort of a very. They have a certain sense of what's right and wrong, or a like an outlook on life, right? But I don't get the sense that the developer is trying to convey a sense of nihilism. Not really, no. I don't know. It's a tough question.
Yeah,
I would also say that it's a game. Sorry.
Oh no, go ahead.
I would comment also that it's the game. I think is very consciously against determinism. It tells you that your choices have impact, and I think that really worked, because you can be fully immersed in the game, and you don't feel like stuff just happens for you. You really have to know what you're doing and to plan, to strategize. So I think that helps. But of course, I thought it was really clever that the prices went up as things were getting worse. I thought, wow, that is very close to home. So maybe that was the most nihilistic thing, that we're living it, but.
Yeah. But that also maybe have like a moral dilemma, because I kind of had to shut down the game for a minute and think like, oh God, am I a terrible person? Because I was playing through it, and then like I saw that the prices were getting up. And I'm like, well, what if I just like start over and then buy the food on the first day when it's cheap? But then I'm like, oh God, I'm going to buy all the food, and then everybody else isn't going to have food. And that makes me a terrible person. No, I can't do that. And so like you have these like odd moral dilemmas that are happening. That's not really nihilism, but I legit had to come and like step away from the game, because I'm like, no, you can't make other people starve because you want to have the cheap food. You can't do that.
Yeah. I think
but like my gameplay mind was saying like, oh, that's the best way to do it, because you're trying to play the game at the same time, but you don't want to just completely doom all these people either.
Yeah, I agree.
And honestly, like that the game kind of recognizes those things is kind of novel in itself, because if you play RPGs like that's 10 years or older, like you can just go into house and steal, and it's been like people's been complaining about it since like the 90s, and yeah, that's still not unusual in current day games, right? So
yeah. Market economics are important in Age of Empires. I will tell you, yeah, in those games you do have to plan ahead the food that you will buy. But in story-driven games, this is very fresh, yeah.
Slightly unrelated, but something that I think is worth talking about is, as I was wandering around the town, I did see several instances of just violence against women with no explanation. And I didn't see much of that towards anyone else. Like there was one instance where there was a woman who was just set on fire, and then like there's no explanation as to why she was set on fire.
Jesus.
And she's dressed in like a very exposed outfit as well. There was another instance where I was running around and there were like 4 or 5 men just chasing a woman trying to punch her. And like if you try and do anything to intervene, then you get the like sad baby sound. So like your reputation goes down for trying to help this woman. And if you just let them go, they punch her and like kill her. They murder her in the middle of the streets and just walk away. And so it was very off-putting to me that I was just like, okay, there's this inexplicable violence against women in this game that like there's no context for it, there's no explanation for it, it just happens. And I didn't see any of that towards anyone else in the game.
How horrible. I didn't notice that. Did anyone else notice any weird event like that?
I did not, although in fairness, I mostly just kind of kept to myself in the game. I was mostly just going and talking to the people related to the murder and things like that.
That would put me off a lot if I had witnessed that event, and I would have.
It was very
quit the
upsetting.
game.
It's not surprising, I think, given the year of the release. I guess lots of stuff hadn't happened. But I have a question actually. When a game is remastered, what does that mean in terms of gameplay? What exactly can you normally change?
Yeah, usually the gameplay doesn't change. What usually is improved, revamped, is the assets. So the visual elements, the music, because you want to, fortunately, attend a demand that apparently is out there for a game that either is not easy to access anymore. With Nintendo, that happens sadly artificially even, that they on purpose make it hard for you to buy a game. But there are some other games that, like this one, originally was released, I believe, as a CD. So it makes sense that eventually when Steam came around, like for people like us, a re-release would make sense. Every developer, according to the resources that they have, decide how much they want to change their game. In this particular title, I don't know what was changed.
As far as I know, what was changed was they added controller support, they updated the graphics, they added widescreen support, and they gave you HD resolutions. As far as I know, that was the core of what was changed. What you brought up is a huge debate over what constitutes a remake versus a remaster versus a re-release. I've seen a lot of games change a lot of things and still call it just a remaster. Metro, as I mentioned earlier, is one of them. I've seen people call things full-blown remakes when in reality they just up the textures a little bit. But as far as I know, with Pathologic, those were the main things that they changed, was all technical stuff. It still didn't like my monitors, though. Despite being updated to HD, it took me like 20 minutes to get this game to run. Which was obnoxious. I have to play it in windowed mode because it's ridiculous. But I'm used to that. I was talking about it with somebody else. I was like, it's fun. Imagine just booting up a game and it working. Why would you want that? I need a puzzle in order to get this. Make me work for it. But no, so the content should be basically the same.
Yeah, and it is a shame that, well, I didn't know about this event, and I worry that if I go into Steam reviews, maybe that will be a positive side to it, that there is this realism. I worry that could happen, because I've seen that in some other games.
But that's very contradictory, because how is your reputation supposed to grow? You're supposed to do something about any kind of violent act and to help people with their quests, but then that seems really arbitrary if that didn't happen.
Yeah, I mean, it's just bizarre to me that, like, there's no reason why these guys are chasing her that you know of, and you can't intervene vocally. And so, like, if you try and take them down, like, I had a scalpel, and I was like, I had the crying baby sound. I was like, well, my reputation went down because I tried to save this woman, and I murdered, I guess, some hooligan punching her to death.
That's probably a good critique, because a lot of games, because this is something that we talked about before, because like games are not often not like who's the actor, who's the player in this, and how the game sort of, what is the game sort of saying to the avatar? Are we just the audience, or are we the one playing it, right? So I don't know, like it seems like this game is aware of it, but it's a big problem for games.
I mean, the thing is, like, it's something that I think as games mature as an art form, they kind of earn the right to talk about more sensitive subjects, and you know, that's absolutely allowed. But that carries with it a certain responsibility of context. Mm-hmm. You know, like one of the games that I was playing recently, I'm just playing along, and all of a sudden it just randomly drops a homophobic slur. Game came out in 2009. It is not a period piece or anything like that, and it made me put the game down for a minute and kind of think about what is the context of this and things like that. You know, like I've had this conversation before with other people in that there are certain situations where, for example, a character you're not supposed to be sympathetic to says or does something that we consider, you know, not okay. Is that still something where you should be critiquing the developers? And to what degree? You know, I find it a little bit weird that we will completely ignore the fact that villains, you know, will commit complete genocide on people, but if they say the wrong thing, now all of a sudden we're angry, despite the fact that they killed thousands of people. But it does matter, you know, and at some level, part of why I think it matters is because there's a fantasy sort of detachment. You know, the violence that's going on isn't real until it becomes realistic. The idea of, like, dropping the slur, that was a very real moment in a game that was otherwise fantastical. And I think that it's easy to kind of excuse some of that away, and that it's not real, it's not happening. But the moment something happens that is real and that does happen, then all of a sudden it becomes a problem.
Yeah.
And so, like, and especially whenever something like that is presented without any type of criticism or anything like that, it makes you wonder what the motivations were behind it, you know?
And whose morality are we following in terms of this reputation? Because, like, personally, I would think that intervening is the right thing, and obviously the game says that that is not the right thing.
Yeah.
So what are the parameters here of what is the right thing to do and what is the wrong thing to do?
Yeah. Because I think that it could be interesting to have a reputation system that is detached from morality, in the sense that you are the intruder coming in and telling these villagers, hey, this is not how you're supposed to be living your life, and therefore your reputation decreases. But the game has to establish that. Yeah. It has to establish that this is separate from the morality of the player, that, you know...
that would improve a lot the game, Bobcat, if the game included exactly what you mentioned, that because you are telling these towns people how to live, maybe that's why they react adversely. However, again, we lack feedback, as in many other instances of this game. However, in this time, I believe, well, the game is not as good as it could be. Something that I also see with this instance that Anne mentioned is a recurring problem for us developers, solipsism. And that is that sometimes we don't validate key things with our audience. We push too far just being artists and creating things because we believe that, yeah, that would be a fun instance to kill these women. However, I always stress, and that's why we're chatting, that the game should serve players. Unfortunately, players are becoming ever more sophisticated, demanding, and like you guys are doing, you are saying, well, this is not right. I don't care that we're in this Russian dystopia. This is not right. It doesn't make sense, or something is lacking, like the context you mentioned, Bobcat. And this verification with players is sadly something that is really not popular among developers. I've spoken with AAA and with indie games, and I haven't met yet someone who validates these kinds of things. Eventually, it's too expensive to correct them. When you put out a trailer and people react adversely, I understand that. However, there is a sweet spot during pre-production, and I really believe that games would improve if we validated more with players like yourselves.
Yeah.
And I think the debate is, to what extent do we want the gaming industry to be held to the same esteem or standard as the film industry? Because gratuitous scenes are very often judged in films, and that's of course fair. But there's not so much. It's as if criticism just bounces right off of video games. It's like you say one thing, but it just doesn't apply for some reason or other. Maybe because it's more game developing is more aesthetically driven. I'm not sure what the answer is, but the ethical, let's say, roadmap for films is just more clear at this point.
Mm-hmm. I think, like I said, as gaming matures, I think that it earns the right to tackle these topics, but what it means is that you have to be constantly listening to your audience. Like, something that I did like, it was Swery who worked on Deadly Premonition 2. He had some scenes in there that were problematic. And when the audience called him out, now his response wasn't great, but I did at least applaud the response of, I'm sorry, let's change this. Again, whether or not his fixes actually worked is another issue. But that response, I think, was at least the healthy, responsible response from the industry, as opposed to, for example, CD Projekt Red's responses of, I don't know what you guys are upset about. I think it's fine. Let's keep going. Let's double down, in fact. Let's make it even worse. Let's lean into it. The idea is that you have to be a mature adult about it, and you have to accept that responsibility. And I think that it's even okay to have that discussion and say, all right, here's the context, here's why we did this, here's why we made this choice, and you have to be willing to talk about it. But the problem is, I think that a lot of game devs kind of get it into their head that this is my project, this is my baby, and any criticism of it, I'm just going to ignore, because this is the thing that I want to make. People start crying censorship and things like that. And unfortunately, we also have large portions of gamers and people within the industry who actively sort of rebel against these norms and who say, oh, why are you giving in to whoever for complaining? But yeah, I think if you're going to include sensitive materials, it carries with it that responsibility to actually look at how and why.
And you bring up a good thing with Swery is that the next game that was made with White Owls was actually a very impactful story, and one that he specifies in the credits and every interview. I talked to many, many people about this game before I actually made it because I wanted to do it right. And so that really shows some kind of development and growth of him as a game developer as well. And understanding hey, the thing that I did with Deadly Premonition 2 was not okay. And so let me make sure that I do something correct with the narrative in the next one that I make. And he did a fantastic job, and it was awesome. And then you have a game like Catherine that, Catherine had some very problematic moments in it. And Catherine in and of itself, you play as a scumbag. The main character is a scumbag, period. And, he says some really terrible things, and I understand that. The problem is that Atlas, when they re-released it, had some opportunities to fix some of the issues with dialogue and some of the issues with gameplay, but they doubled down and made it worse.
Yes, Atlas.
And they did the same thing with Persona 5.
Yes.
Yep.
And I think the other big difference there is that regardless of how Swery handled things, at the very least he showed that remorse and he showed that sympathy. Whereas Atlas just tends to show contempt for the players and gamers in general, and just kind of seem to, they're like, I don't know, we make games and you'll buy them, so get to it. Yeah. Which is not a healthy attitude to have.
I believe that related to what Ito was raising about what is the ethical discourse for our industry. I believe it's very set upon by the market dynamics. As Lovecraft says, if Atlas can double down on this and people will buy it, then it gives a very clear signal that you don't need to police your content up to the standards of, let's say, the film industry. However, there is a possibility there for improvement, because there's now the possibility of publishers, of some stores, to invest in games, and those games don't need to be bought on a unit per unit basis as it was all the time before. There's now subscriptions. And so with Microsoft, with the Epic Game Store that are now funding games that do not need to be bought, as I mentioned, maybe that will change if people actually subscribe a lot to one of these stores or buy in one of these stores. And eventually one of these games may not be as bought as, let's say, Call of Duty, but it has some kind of social impact as, let's say, a movie that wins an Academy Award and by raising awareness about an issue. There's been so many of those. Then it might not be as profitable as the next Call of Duty. However, it can raise the standards of what is the discourse of our industry. So I do look forward for those titles. I believe a few of the games that Apple has funded are having this kind of different perspectives. For example, there is one game about a teenage girl who falls in love for the very first time, and you don't kill things, you just fall in love, and that's cute, and it's necessary, I believe. It has gorgeous art. I wonder, however, if developers will actually take advantage of this opportunity, because, I mean, it depends on us developers to actually go to these companies to pitch something different, and not many of us want to do that. Most of us, like the Atlas example that you gave, Bobcat and Anne, well, we see the market and we see a risk. If we don't double down on the action or on controversies, on the violence, maybe we won't get users. And I hope that more and more people lose the fear out of those dynamics, out of those pressures.
Yeah, well, I mean, it's something that I've talked about before, is the idea that gaming has changed, and really since about the mid-2000s it's been changing, with things like the Wii selling so well and introducing a whole bunch of new people to games, or things like Call of Duty 4, which was a landmark title in terms of multiplayer and bringing more people in. I think that you're seeing...
Mobile gaming.
Yeah. Yes, mobile gaming, absolutely. And I think that what you're seeing is what you're talking about is absolutely happening within the indie space. If you go and look at Game Jolt or Itch or anything like that, you're seeing a ton of games that absolutely fit that kind of mold. But unless they get really big, like something like Night in the Woods is a really interesting example of an indie game that got big without that kind of action. You know, it was never going to sell the however many ridiculous number of units necessary for like Activision Blizzard. But at the same time, I think that it brought with it these sort of indie sensibilities and kind of introduced people to the idea of indie gaming. You know, and right now I feel like there's almost two different worlds that exist in gaming, of the people playing very casual multiplayer games or buying like the new big AAA releases because gaming is kind of what's in, and then the smaller nature of people going out and buying indie games and actually having these discussions and critiques and things like that. The people like Cyberpunk 2077 sold like 13 million units. A lot of the people who are playing Cyberpunk 2077 are a very different group from the people who are playing Night in the Woods or who are playing, you know, the Mystic JJ Macfield or something like that, where it's you have these kind of two different worlds, you know. And like for me, I work in a very different field than pretty much everybody here, in that I am very much a blue collar worker who talks to people. You know, the people who I talk to who are my age are people who they go out and they buy a PlayStation and they buy Call of Duty and, you know, like the big releases, God of War, Last of Us, things like that. But they're not the type of people who are going to sit down and play Hollow Knight. They're not the type of people who are going to sit down and play, you know, Papers, Please, like I mentioned earlier. That's just not on their radar.
Or Kentucky Route Zero, which should be mentioned because that game's great.
Yeah, sure. It's the type of thing that, like, when you see all these sales, they're not from the same people that I think a lot of us are associating with more online and talking with. They're from a different sort of audience.
Yeah, I agree. Go ahead, Jonas. I thought you...
I was going to say that Bobcat raised a really good point. I think we look at all the money that's going into gaming, and we look at how pretty they are and so on. But if you sort of look at like game design or something, we're still way down the road. We might play games, but we haven't really even established like conventions or norms, or like we're not really sure how to interpret our games or even talk about them. So it's we might not be as far ahead as we might think. In a way. So yeah.
It is a matter of genre, though. I would agree that, and in that sense, it is relevant to literature and gaming, because the same people don't read the same stuff. You know, like different people read different things, and I think with gaming specifically, some really hard questions have to be asked, like who are the people who only buy specific games for the violence? I think that tells us something more about what we like to do in our free time. And I don't mean that, you know, if you play a violent video game, you go out and you really shoot people. But considering that there's been studies, of course, how racist and sexist the language of war is. And I mean, I have personal experience because my friends really love Call of Duty. And whenever I'm in a room with them, it's like, I just have to get out, because this is what, you know, and multiplayer games, I think they have something very militant to them, I guess. So I think the same people would not be also buying and playing What Remains of Edith Finch, which is a game I loved a long time ago.
Sure.
So,
I agree
one of the games
completely. Yeah. Go ahead, Bobka.
Yeah. One of the games I'd love to bring up, because it's an example of a game that tried to bridge that gap, was Spec Ops: The Line. It's a game that I really love it. I think it's a great game, but it was a shooter, so it didn't necessarily appeal to the crowd that would have liked the themes and stories of it. And the themes and stories of it didn't necessarily appeal to the same people who enjoyed the shooting aspect of it. It was a fairly generic third-person shooter. But I do at least applaud that effort to take that genre and do something more with it and elevate it beyond just here's a linear succession of guys, shoot them. You know, it included a multiplayer mode, which was a little bit baffling and seemed to kind of run counter to the themes of the game. But you know, like I really liked that. I can't remember if it was last night or the night before, I talked about how Call of Duty Cold War, of all games, actually had some really interesting, poignant moments in it that I think took that basic COD formula and actually elevated it. You know, toward the end, it draws on, like, what are the final level draws on the Stanley Parable of all things, where you're recounting a fight in Vietnam, and you have a choice at various points of whether you want to follow the narrative that you're being led down or whether you want to go and do something different. It actually draws on PT as well, where you're going through a circular sort of hallway and things are changing and your perception is changing. And I think that those are probably going to be what gets some of those players into that indie narrative space. But I think also there's always going to be that little bit of a divide in those two sets, you know.
Totally. More or less.
We actually had a.
Go ahead, Jonas.
We had a conversation about genre. For
that was
a long
what
time
was I
ago.
gonna say? Yeah, our most expert or most curious person about genre, would be our very own Jonas, who sets the trends on Reddit.
But yeah, so we should probably have that conversation some other time, because I'm not sure what to say right now. But yeah, that's because I think that's really important, right? Because if you don't have conventions, it's hard to interpret the game.
Yeah, I believe we can, if you guys like, wrap it up by establishing that genre is something very interesting, because since it attracts people that are already into that, it could also be the way to analyze games. It could establish some conventions in order to better analyze it. So if you guys like, we can vote during the week about which game, because of its genre, would be very sweet to play and analyze with you guys together, because I really enjoyed how, with your multiple perspectives, I enjoyed Pathologic 1 much more. At the same time, I was more repulsed after what you mentioned, and fortunately I did not experience that. But yeah,
I'm glad that none of you guys experienced it, because that was really, really upsetting.
Yeah, it could be.
Yeah.
But it was great seeing you guys. And if you guys have any closing remarks, please share it. And more importantly, your links will also be shared. As I mentioned to you, I really want this to reach this critical mass of smart players like yourselves that fortunately I meet a lot. And you and Ito have already shared your links. Ava, I already know by heart your links, obviously. Jonas and Bobcat, if you guys want to share something as well, please send it to me. I believe I will create a new YouTube channel because I believe this sort of scholars meet players should be like a thing by itself. I think many people will be attracted to that.
Cool.
Awesome.
Yeah, I've had a great time talking with you guys. Even like off the stream, I was chatting with you about some other games and preservation, that kind of stuff. And I just love talking about this. I could talk about it all day, every day, which is why I have a podcast about video games. But it was a blast. I'm real excited that we got to do this.
Thank you so much, Anne. It is exciting to have all of you guys in one place. It is magical for me. So we'll vote during the week here on the Discord that now all of you have access. You can propose any game that seems interesting to you, and once we have a few options, 3, 4 options, something like that, we can vote. And we'll set a new milestone on how many hours or how many minutes we'll play and comment.
Yeah.
Sounds great.
Awesome. So see you around and take care.
Thanks for talking.
Great. Take care, everyone. Thank you.